So thank you everybody for joining our data collection webinar for environmental footprinting. It's really nice to see so many people coming for the webinar and that are interested in learning more about this topic. So what you can expect from us today, if you want to, so we want to tell you a little bit more about who should actually be involved in data collection in your company. What type of data do you need and from who? And how are you actually going to collect this data? We're also going to be doing a Q&A at the end, but you can already start sharing your questions throughout our conversation in the Q&A chat. And our lovely colleague Zasla will be having a look at that as well as the chat. So she's going to let us know at the end what are the most pressing questions on this topic. So our speakers today are our lovely Ieke, who is our environmental specialist here at Ecochain. So Ieke, if you can shortly introduce yourself.
Yes, of course. Hi, everybody. My name is Ieke, as Hanni said. I have a background in sustainable business and innovation, and I work now quite some time at Ecochain. And on a daily basis, I help clients in the modeling and calculating the environmental footprint of their products.
Nice. And of course, myself and the host, I'm Hanni Larma. I'm working in the marketing team at Ecochain, and I'm also hosting our podcast called Speaking of Sustainability. Maybe some of you have already listened to some of our episodes. In case you haven't, check it out. We're on all the big podcast platforms as well as you can find it on our website. So have a listen to that. We talk about kind of similar topics as to what we speak about in our webinars. And then, of course, we have our moderator, Zasla Quist, who's a colleague of mine from the marketing team. So as I mentioned, she will be having a look at our Q&A chat as well as the normal chat to see what types of questions you guys have for us today. So hi, Zasla.
Hello. Hi, everybody. I will be checking out all your questions and really looking forward to also reading any comments you might have in the chat. I'm also in the marketing team with Hanni, and we can't wait to get this started. So let's do it.
Lovely. So what we wanted to kind of start off with today is actually, why do we need data in environmental footprinting, and why is it so important to collect this data? So Ieke, if you can start us off with this question.
Of course, Hanni. Well, in Dutch, we have a saying, meten is weten. That's in English, measuring is knowing. And it's important, of course, to base your measurements on the data that you have. Otherwise, you cannot measure anything. So data collection is a really important part in having an environmental footprint or an impact. And it's actually creating a new data flow. So in your company, because sustainability data is not quite common yet. And that's why it's really important that you pay attention to this phase and stage.
Right. And it's also, of course, gives you knowledge on what you're actually measuring and where you are now, I think, also in terms of if you're, for example, measuring to improve your products, your products to make them more sustainable, you need to have that real data to know how are you actually going to improve the product and have that knowledge on everything that is happening within your product, from its processes to all types of different things.
Exactly.
Nice. So next, I think it's really important to start off with who is actually responsible for collecting this data in the organization. So who should actually be the project owner, and does this differ from company to company? What have you seen in your conversations that you have with some of our clients?
Yes, what I often see is that there's a sustainability manager who is in charge of this project, and then they motivate and collect the right people who can join and deliver the data to the project. But what I also often see is that there's no sustainability manager available yet, because it's a new topic in the company, And then often a very enthusiastic person who is passionate about sustainability takes on this role. But in the end, often you see that person evolve into a kind of sustainability manager in the end. I think it's important to have people who are enthusiastic about the topic. If you don't have a sustainability manager, often a product manager, for example, could be this person.
Yeah. And what if you don't have someone who is able to be the sustainability manager? Maybe you have different types of product owners depending on what type of company it is. Are there some other people who could step in and actually help with this process?
Yes, I think from purchasing also there's some people who can be found there because they have a lot of contact with the supplier and know a lot about the raw materials as well. But of course, the main thing that's important is that you're passionate about sustainability and that you get the time and resources for your company to spend on this project.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that the person who we're speaking about now is going to be the person who's kind of the project owner. So the one that's starting the project within the company to do sustainability, but they might not be the person who actually maybe holds the data that you need to collect later on. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, it's important to have that person who is the project owner to ensure that there is uh, that focus on the project as well.
Exactly. And the other departments that you see listed here, that's actually the department that holds the data. So you need to involve all these departments in your kickoff, for example, for the project. But there should be one person, of course, the project leader.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So next, so now we know who is the owner of that project, but what should that person actually be measuring? And again, does that differ from company to company? How could you kind of explain the process of actually figuring out what you want to measure?
Yes, well, first you have to decide together with your project team what's the scope of your project. So, do you want to focus on specific products that you have that you maybe want to develop into more sustainable products? Is it really an R&D assignment for your case, or do you just want to measure your whole product portfolio? And that's more of the case for large producing companies instead of companies with a smaller product portfolio, for example. So that also differs from company to company, and that's good to have in mind. You can also do both at the same time, of course, if you have a large product portfolio but also want to focus on specific products to develop further. And then after that, you have to decide which part of the life cycle do you want to analyze. And you see here on the slide, you see a nice picture of the life cycle of the product. The most common one is cradle to gate. So that's the most centered one. And this means from raw material extraction, transport to your production facility, and to the production processes. So really only the things that you as a company hold within your scope. And then you can also decide to go further with your scope and also include the use and the end of waste phase. For these ones, you have to create scenarios based on what's common in your industry. But we'll also talk about that later a little bit more.
And for maybe some people who are a bit more new to measurement, could you quickly explain what you mean by scope?
Oh, yes, of course. So the scope is really which stages of the life cycle you want to include. So you see the 5 points in the model. So the first one, raw materials. The second, transport. The third one, production processes. And then you have a fourth, so let's say the use phase and the end of life phase. It's the fifth then.
Yeah, so it's important to determine before you start measuring what do you actually want to measure. So is that indeed, as you mentioned, individual products or your entire product portfolio? And then second to that, you also need to determine which parts of the product's life cycle are you actually measuring.
Yes. Often what I recommend clients is first to focus on the product, the cradle to gate, so the production scope, because that's the data you hold of your own company, and then later add the use in the end of waste scenarios.
Okay, nice. Okay, so these ones are clear. If you have any questions about that, indeed put them in the chat or the Q&A. And okay, so we know who is responsible, we know what we're measuring, and now it's time to create the project plan. So could you tell us about what is really important to include in this plan, and why is that? Why are those things important?
Yes, definitely. Well, first of all, there's going to be a kickoff presentation with the entire responsible team and that you created. So everyone is aligned. What's the goal, the scope, repeating it, how does it work? Uh, then there's going to be kind of training of how to do it in the tools, for example, and also the data collection phase that you see here. That's usually the biggest and longest part of this whole scope and time frame. And that's why it's really important that you understand where you need to get the data from, who's responsible, and that they're all really aligned on which they need to deliver. Because if this data collection phase it goes over time, then the whole project also gets longer. So that's really good to have in mind. And this is a process that the client is really responsible for. So you in the company yourself, and we can, of course, support you with it, with the questions on, oh, where do I find this data, or who can I ask about this? But that's really something that you have to find out for yourself.
Nice. And I think, yeah, that's so many good points there. And I think that what you were speaking about having all the time frames in place and involving that entire team that you've built up, the sustainability project team, is so important because once you have everything in a structured way and you have these time frames and you have the budget set, it's also so much easier to get all the people within your company rallied together and working together. Because as I know, we've spoken about it before that yeah, having the successful project plan is also about having the entire team on board and making sure everybody knows what's happening and when and what do you need from them at what time as well.
Definitely. Yes, sometimes I see one very enthusiastic sustainability manager, but they didn't include then, for example, the right persons at the beginning of the project, and then it gets really difficult in the data collection phase.
Right. Okay, so now it's time to talk about, we spoke about the person who is responsible and maybe some of the people who should be included in the team. But as I've also understood, there's different people who are responsible for the different data within the company. So could you elaborate a little bit about what data you need and from who specifically for the type of information you need?
Yes, of course. Well, we start at the energy uses, emissions, and waste. That's created and used when you create the products that you make. And where can you get this data from? This is usually just from the finance department, for example, because they have to pay the bills and also for the usages emissions. And for waste, you also have to pay for that to be collected. So this is really where you can find it. And sometimes when there's already a sustainability project running in your company, the sustainability department will also hold this data because you need it as well for other reports.
Yeah, I find that also so interesting because when you think of sustainability, I mean, of course, the entire company often revolves around having the finances in place, but you don't always associate someone from finance holding sustainability information. So I think that's also a really interesting point that you need to really involve departments like finance who, yeah, might not directly come to mind when you think of sustainability.
Yeah, that's true.
Interesting.
Okay, so next up we have the purchased and used raw materials that you use to create your products. So, for example, if you buy steel or specific types of textiles, You buy them from suppliers, of course. And what we actually need from this part of the information is, okay, what type of material does it consist of? So what type of aluminium, for example, what type of textile? Is it cotton or is it polyester? And what we then also want you to find out is, where does it come from? So where is your supplier located? Which city, which country, and how does it get to your production location? And this is actually very, a kind of funny practice in sustainability data, because what we always use is just Google Maps for this. And if it's transported over sea or over inland water, we also have specific websites for that are kind of like Google Maps, but then for waterways. So yeah, this is information you usually can find with the purchasing departments, because they have all the contacts with the suppliers, of course.
Okay. And for someone who has never started this process before, how do you actually go about using Google Maps to gain this information?
Well, first you create a list of all your suppliers, and then you just, I hope that there's also a list of the location and the name of the company. But then you just go to Google Maps and you ask someone within your company, hey, can you fill out and look it all up in Google Maps to our production location?
Okay, so that's a pretty simple process in a way, even though it
It's
sounds
a
quite.
simple process, but if you have like 400 suppliers, it takes a lot of time. And
Time consuming, yeah.
I don't think people expect this.
Yeah, no, it is quite surprising.
Yeah. So then we have the next step. So for the production processes you have in your production facility, we want to know about the energy uses, emissions, and waste. In which process comes which free. Um, but how is it distributed among the processes? That's what we want to know. And also which products go to which processes. Because not each product goes to the same production line in your company. And we want to know the different the distribution types. Who can help with this is a process engineer and a product owner. So the product owner really knows, okay, where does it go, the product through the production line. And the process engineer can tell you more about, okay, this process more energy intensive in this type of energies, and here comes a lot of waste free. So yeah, this is a kind of technical aspect. Yeah, that's it.
Could you shortly also elaborate a bit? Because we, of course, also already mentioned energy usage and waste in our first slide. So,
Mhm.
what is the difference between this energy usage and that energy usage?
Can you repeat the question?
So, we already, of course, mentioned energy usage in a different context in our first slide. So, what is the difference when you're looking at per process and the previous energy usage, which was more the finance and that type of thing?
Yeah, thank you. Well, actually, it's the same thing, because you take the information from the slide one, so the total energy uses of the year which you paid for, and you take that into consideration when you want to divide it over the processes. So, for example, you have one total, you have 3 processes, you divide it over the processes. And that's what the process engineer can tell you how to
Nice.
distribute it.
So this one is just more of a zoomed in look at each different process and kind of allocating each of those, for example, energy usage to those processes that we're doing.
Yes, that's exactly the point. Yeah.
Perfect.
So then next we have the product composition. And this is also often referred as to the bill of materials. And what we ask of you to provide here is actually kind of a recipe of your product. So, for example, you have a chair made out of wood and steel, for example. Then we want to know how much kilograms of steel and how much kilograms of wood go in there. It's really just that simple. But again, you might be surprised. Not very. Not sometimes it happens that companies don't have this available. Maybe the people listening are thinking, do we have that available? But what also sometimes happens is that when you don't have it available, you just ask your suppliers. So that's why you need the purchasing department. And other ones, you just ask the product owner because they have a pretty good image about this. And if you don't get the information from these two people or departments, you can always just get a measuring scale. And I've actually seen clients do this, just weigh every component of your product and place it on a scale and just write it down in the computer. That's always also an option.
Yeah, I've heard you mention this before as kind of the recipe of your product, which I think is a really kind of actionable way of looking at it. So when you're building a product, that's like, what recipe is this product made out of? What are all the components that it's built up of? So I think that's a really interesting way of looking at that as well.
Yeah.
Nice. So this is indeed the wrap up of what is in the LCA, so the life cycle assessment, and what needs to be included in that. So it is indeed a bit of a recap of everything that's in there, but maybe you can just give us a small summary again.
Yeah, definitely. So at point 1, you see the company level. We want to know the year overview of all that you bought in. So the specific usages and emissions. So how much electricity, gas, diesel, water that you used. Which kind of raw materials did you buy in? What are these materials exactly? What's the transport distances to your location? How much waste it generated, and what kind of emissions did you have in your production processes on a yearly basis? Then step 2 is the processes. Which type of processes are there? What's the distribution of these usages and emissions over there? And here you can see you can use the meters if you have those on the processes. Often those are not there. So then you need the process engineer. And then finally, the information about the product. What is the product's name, for example? What's the weight? What's the units? Do you use square meters or kilograms? And then what's it made of? So what's the recipe?
Nice. Great. And again, if you have any questions on that, please keep putting those in the chat. I see Zoslan's busy with it.
Good.
Okay, so we kind of have the beginning steps said. We know who is responsible, what data we need. We know who owns the data, and how you can get there. But where do you actually start from? Where do you start the measuring from? What is the beginning things that you really have to get busy with?
Yes, of course, this data collection phase, I just went quickly over all the things you have to do. That's when you're collecting data, it keeps getting back, and slowly some data gets in earlier than other data. And when do you really start? I would suggest always to start with the hotspots. So first focus on the products that sell the most or that you expect that have the highest impact, because those are the ones you want to first go into a bit more of a higher overview. And if you say, okay, I see that this component has a really large environmental impact, I want to know more about it, then it's worth the effort to go deeper into the details and ask your supplier more detailed information, way maybe more detailed the different components that are in there.
And how do you find out what those impact hotspots or those components that you think have the largest environmental impact are? How do you find those ones out?
Well, I think that's the items that you sold the most of. That's a good way to start, but also a very generalistic view of the components, for example, that are in there. And then you can do a quick hotspot analysis about that. And then the first preliminary results will show you where to find more data.
Yeah. So you kind of do that initial calculation, and then through that calculation, you'll find out what you need more information on and what are the really important things that you need to collect further data and more information on.
Exactly. And a tip is here, for example, with transportation distances. I know that some clients get lost in all the details because they really want to know the specific kilometer specific details. But then I always suggest them, if it's like 5 kilometers old, it's totally fine. But if, for example, the weighing of the materials in your product, in the recipe of your products are like more off, that's more important. So here I can also assist you, for example, in which choices you have to make here.
Nice.
And let's see. Yeah, sometimes you also want to request primary data. So we also, if you contact your suppliers, for example, for transportation distances or what's the specific raw material, you can also ask about primary data for their products that they deliver to you. And maybe your suppliers also did an environmental footprint analysis already, and they can share the data with you. And then you can really use the most specific data that's available that you buy in. And otherwise, when this is not available, you can choose more generic references from a database, for example, Eco Events database.
And so you speak a little bit about like if you have too little data or too much data, what's the kind of difference? So what can you do if you don't have that much data available? Is that then using those databases, and what does that still give you?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you have too little information, so for example, your suppliers don't have environmental profiles of their products, then you can use indeed the more generic references that are available in the database. And there you have like really generic references, like for the whole world, that's representative for that. Or you can have more specific references. So for example, if you buy steel from Poland, you can, for example, choose that reference instead of the whole world reference for steel.
A little bit more specific, even in the more generic choices.
Yeah, definitely.
And could you give an example of what is too much data? Because I think for a lot of people, it might sound like, okay, how can you have too much data on your products? Isn't that a good thing?
Yes, it is a good thing if you have so much data available, but how much variance there is between your products, that's also something to take into account. Because what if you have, for example, 5,000 products? Do you want to know the specific footprint of each product, or do you have product categories that are really similar, just slightly off? And in that case, you can create representative category groups. And then the environmental impact data can differ 20% within the impact indicator groups for it to be representative. So you can also create those things. That makes it a little bit more easy to understand.
Yeah. Do you have an example maybe of what could be that representative category, for example, in maybe a clothing brand, or
Um,
is that like jeans, or is it t-shirts? Is that like the two different representative categories, for example?
yes, I think jeans is still a bit too generic then, but maybe you can say, okay, jeans that are dyed with this specific paint or this specific process. So you can go a little bit more detailed, but not too much. And
Right.
again, there you need to take into account the hotspots. Yeah.
Nice. Clear. Right. The final data do's. So I think this is a little bit touching upon how we can get the best results from the data that we've collected. So what is a way to ensure the best success of our data collection and our what we want to use it for in our end product?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned already, ask for specific data from your suppliers on the environmental impact of their products. That's really important. Also, when you get that, often you get lower or, so to say, better results for the environmental impact than when you're using more generic references. And when you want to use, also include the use and end of life scenarios for your product, then you can choose scenarios, and then maybe based on your own expectations or what you have proven to find for your products, or you can use industry standards or reports.
Nice. So I think also one of the important things to take into consideration here, I mean, I think it does go along with each of the steps that we already spoke about, but having a structure in data collection and with the data in general is super important. Can you tell us a little bit about why that is?
Yes, definitely. Because you're getting your information and your data from all these kind of different departments in your company. It's really important that you have to do that in a structured way. So it can be repeated, for example, next year or the year after. Because if you want to improve your products portfolio or your separate products, you really need to repeat this exercise once in a while. And if your data collection is somewhat vague or something, then you cannot repeat it exactly. And also everyone needs to know, okay, this is the data part I'm responsible for providing to the sustainability project. So that's really important. And yeah, it's good to keep in mind that you're really creating a new data flow within your company, kind of similar to the financial structure or another structure. But this is totally new, so people need to get used to it. And also in creating it, it's really good to take into account and what you're going to use it for and how your output is going to look like.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Also, if the data is not well structured or well stored, or yeah, you don't have that structure, the new data flow, as you mentioned, in place, it's really hard to use that data and make sure that you are using it properly and that the values are yeah, all as they should be in the place they should be. So that's indeed really important for yeah the um, so that you could reproduce the measurements the next time around.
Yeah.
So we have a free data collection checklist for all of you that are attending today. So it will have all of the different steps that we spoke about, and it's kind of a summary, but also something that you can really take in an actionable way with you when you're doing your data collection. So it's really nice to kind of review each of these points and to be able to make sure that all the steps are followed as they should be. So that's something that we will send to you via email after this webinar as well. And of course, also if you want to take this from theory to action, we have two tools that we're working with at Ecochain. So maybe you can tell us, Ieke, a bit the difference between the Ecochain Helix and the Mobius, just very shortly, because
Yeah.
we are a bit short on time.
Yeah. I mentioned at the beginning, that's good to take into account if you want to include your total product portfolio or want to focus on a couple of products for R&D. And the first tool, Helix, is if you want to calculate the entire product portfolio. And Mobius is really like a plug and play tool to design and for the research and development department. And it's very easy to use. And I think we also have a free trial for 14 days, right, Hannah? Honey?
Yes, exactly. So if we go for the next slide, we can see here, yeah, we have a 14-day trial. So if you want to kind of test how, after you've collected the data, how you can actually then work with it, maybe it gives a little bit more of some insights as well into how you can structure it after you've done the collection side and you want to actually do the measurement and improve your products. You can just have a little tryout with this 14-day trial. So Zasla will also link that in the chat for you. But now it is our Q&A time. So Zasla, could you let us know what all the pressing questions are from the chat and Q&A?
Yes, definitely. And there are a lot in here, so that's great. And one of the first things that came up was when you guys were talking about the Google Transport, the Google Maps. And there were a lot of questions actually that were about what if my products are transported by railway? So how do you approach that then? Is that different? Because of course, Google Maps also, has its limits. So how do you approach that?
Yes. For that, we also use Google Maps for railway, but that's only for passengers, of course. So I would have to check with my colleagues if there's a specific site that we use for that. But there's also specific references for railway use, the transport.
All right, thank you. Then another really interesting question that I got was about it's kind of ISO related. So first of all, does this data need to be validated for you to use it in an LCA? And how can you do this in such a way that it's also ISO, qualified?
Mm-hmm. What you can do is verify your LCA. And what you then have to do is choose standards that you want to comply with. So you have in the ISO 14040 and 41044, and also the 25. But for that, you need to use certain regulations and rules. And if you create this LCA, then you also have to write a background report, which can be verified. And in there, you have to store all the data sources that you used. So this is a pretty elaborate report that you need to have verified by a third party. And then in the end, you can use it, for example, to publish it in an EPD platform, and you can share it with your supplier, with your customers. So yes, it is ISO verified then, because it's always following the highest ISO standard for LCA.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that there are, of course, tools that can help you also do this in a structured way and in the right way that will make it easier for you to also, stick to the ISO certifications. And that's also what we, of course, do with Ecochain. But I think that's a really important question. And I saw that there were multiple people who asked it. So thank you so much, Ieke. Then, then somebody also asked, because in the beginning we were saying, okay, if you have gaps or if you don't have certain information yet from suppliers, so more about the too little data, you were talking about these databases that can help out, especially EcoInvent. Now, I got a couple of questions of people who were wondering, so where do you find this this database? Where can you find this information? Is this open or not? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, of course. Well, Ecoinvent is a worldwide database that has over 800,000 data points. So it's used internationally. And you can go to the site and create a user account. So that's a guest user account where you can see the references that are available, but not the environmental impact that's collected, because for that you will need a license. And you can buy that license yourself for your company, or you can access it via Ecochain, for example. And then you can access it as well.
I see someone was struggling to understand the name. I will quickly type it out. It's called Ecoinvent.
Yeah, that's good. And there are other types of databases also available. For example, the Nationale Milieu database, which is very common in the Netherlands.
Yes, exactly. So then, let's see. In the beginning, okay. So of course we are talking about big product portfolios and more individual products, right? This is also the distinction we make with our tools, for example. So is a manufacturer has a different type of products. I think you already dived into it a little bit, but if you have different types of products that you make, how do you define how much energy you point to which product type?
Yeah, that's a question you have to ask for the process engineer of your own production facility. That's not something we can decide for you, but we can help by, for example, asking, okay, which types of products go through which process? How much more energy intensive is this process compared to the other one? So we can help a bit with that, but this is really the information that your process engineer has to provide.
Yes. Okay. I see someone wanted me to ask about the database from the Netherlands. I mean, it's a Dutch word. So NMD, right? Nationale Milieu Database. Do I have that correct, Ieke?
Yeah, that's true.
There we go. Okay, then let's see, how much time do we still have? Okay, we still have 5 minutes. So sorry, guys, there are a lot of questions in here, but you can always reach out to Hani, Egon, and I and just ask them. I think you will have our emails, so feel free to send us an email anytime with your questions. So now we have, okay, so what if you are a project-based company? So rather than you have, certain product lines all the time, you have just different production lines, so default production lines, so different materials and processes all the time. How do you approach that if you want to do company footprints or, well, footprints over your portfolio?
I think what's important there is that you have to collect all the information for each project then in that way. So I think you cannot really use the year totals of the usages and emissions, for example, but you will have to measure it per project. And then for the other types of information, so the bill of materials of your project, it will be longer because more stuff is in there, of course, because it's a project. But it's also possible. Yeah, definitely. We also have a couple of clients who do it like that.
All right, great. Then let me see. There are a lot of nice ones in here. So, okay, so this one is actually also really interesting. This person works in the secondhand industry, and he or she would like to estimate the avoided impact of reusing a product or versus incinerating it, versus buying a brand new one. So, does this person have to assume that because it's has a second life, you can avoid all the environmental impact that comes from production and transport of brand new products? So how does that work?
Well, that's a very interesting question in the LCA land. This is a topic under debate as well, because you have several methods that you can follow and several allocation methods for that. It depends on which method you are using, which you can apply. For example, in the building and construction sector, you can assume that after the end of waste points, sorry if this gets a bit technical, but after the end of waste points, you can enter the secondary materials, so the second life cycle, you can enter it burden-free. So that means there's no environmental impact from the first life cycle transfer to the second one. However, this does not apply to all sectors, and there's different allocation methods, as I mentioned. For example, the environmental footprint 3.0 method, that's for outside of the construction sector. Those follow different methods. So if you want to know more about this, I would say just send me an email or Zansela, and we can talk about it for hours.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. I think then this is going to be the last question. Let me see. There are a lot of really nice ones in here. Okay, so what do you do with a large portfolio? For example, 10,000 products. You can't measure them all. Well, Ieke, how does that work?
If you want to, you can measure them all, but I just wouldn't advise it. So I really would say try to create these maybe a bit higher categories that you can measure, because I cannot really imagine that all the products that you create are really so different from each other. There must be kind of groupings available that would be better to focus on first. And then I would say if you have 10,000 of projects, just start with the higher categories. And if you see there's really large impact on one category, for example, then you go deeper and try to divide them into more product categories.
Could you mention maybe what you mean by if there's a large impact on a category?
Oh, yes. So, for example, for the clothing example, if you have jeans and t-shirts and you see that the jeans are very high on environmental impact, then you want to specify the jeans further down into more categories and see, okay, which type of jeans have the highest impact, or is it just all the jeans? That's also possible, of course.
Nice.
Yes. All right. Well, I think we are meeting our time limit, and I think everybody would like to have lunch as well after consuming all this information. But we've written down all your questions, and I'll put also the email of Hani, Ieke, and myself into the chat, so you can always send us an email if your answer didn't get answered, if your question didn't get answered. I'm so sorry about that. Then I also saw a couple of messages about, okay, can we find a little bit more information on your software? Yes, of course, it's all on our website as well. I already shared a couple of links. And if you're really focusing, for example, on a product specifically, or just a couple of products, you can try out Mobius, which is our sustainable design tool. And I will also link the free tryout for that in the links here.
Yes, and also for the questions that didn't get answered, as Elsa mentioned, she's written them down. And if there's some bigger questions, we'll also try to address those in our social media. So on our LinkedIn and potentially on our next episodes of our podcast or in our next webinars. All right, thank you very much for joining, and speak to you soon, hopefully again.